The city moved at the speed of a dying pulse. Every street corner, every window, every brick was a relic of a time that had passed decades ago. The youth walked these streets like ghosts, their potential trapped behind iron gates and locked office doors. Inside the central tower, the air was stale, recycled through vents that rattled with every breath. Elias stood in the center of the boardroom, his palms pressed against the cold mahogany table. He felt the weight of the room pressing down a silence so absolute it made his ears ring. He held his blueprints tight, the edges sharp against his skin. This was not a request. It was a solution to a city that was slowly starving for energy. He watched the directors. They sat motionless, eyes fixed on the distant wall, their faces etched with the granite indifference of those who had stopped listening years ago. Elias set the documents down. The sound of paper hitting the wood was the only movement in the room. He looked at the chairman, waiting for the flicker of interest that never came. The city expected them to wait, to rot in the corners of their own ambition, but he had come to force a change. The air grew thinner. He took a breath, prepared to speak, and felt the eyes of the board tighten in anticipation of his dismissal. The chairman did not lean forward. He did not blink. He simply let his gaze slide past the blueprints as if they were nothing more than dust on the table. He raised a single finger, a movement so slight it felt like a dismissal of gravity itself. "We have operated this way for 40 years, the chairman said. His voice carried no malice, only a flat, terrifying certainty that made the room feel smaller. He pushed the documents back toward the edge of the table with the tip of a pen. Elias reached out, his hand hovering over the paper, his fingers twitching with the urge to point out the flaws in the current grid. He opened his mouth to speak, but the chairman waved his hand toward the exit. The gesture was final. Elias pulled the blueprints to his chest, the edges crinkling under the pressure of his grip. He turned on his heel. The heavy wood door swung open with a rhythmic groan. As he stepped out, the latch clicked shut behind him, sealing the room away. He stood alone in the hallway, the sound of his own breathing suddenly loud in the vacuum. He walked, his footsteps striking the floor with a hollow, rhythmic beat that bounced off the high, empty walls. Every step moved him further from the board, and closer to the realization that the door was not just locked, it was bricked shut. The street outside offered no relief. The sun was trapped behind a permanent layer of industrial haze, casting the city in shades of gray. Elias kept his head down, the blueprints still tucked under his arm like a dead weight. He passed the park, a place where the grass had long since surrendered to the soot. Sarah sat on the corner bench, surrounded by a mountain of paper. Her research proposals were scattered across the wood, some fluttering in the stagnant breeze. She did not look up when he approached. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, fingers locked. Elias stopped. He watched the way her shoulders slumped, a mirror of his own exhaustion. He did not need to ask. He saw the rejection stamps, the red ink bleeding into the white pages, the sheer volume of work rendered invisible by a system that refused to see. He sat on the far end of the bench, leaving a wide gap of space between them. They remained silent. No words were needed to describe the air that felt thick enough to choke on, or the way the streetlights above them flickered, struggling to stay lit. They were two anchors in a sea of stalled progress, staring at the pavement while the city groaned around them. The weight of their unspent potential hung between them, heavy and cold as iron. The kitchen was a tomb of stale air and shadows. Elias pushed the door shut, the latch, engaging with a finality that usually brought him comfort. Tonight, it felt like a cage. He walked to the table and emptied his bag. Calipers, drafting pens, and metal rulers hit the surface with a sharp, echoing clatter that cut through the silence. Sarah watched from the corner, her gaze fixed on the spread of cold tools. She did not speak, but her posture shifted, the tension in her neck relaxing into a sudden, alert stillness. Elias did not look at the walls or the flickering lamp above them. He looked directly at her. His hands moved to the center of the table, pressing down on the wood as if testing its strength. "We have spent years trying to force these doors open," he said, his voice low and steady. "But they are not just locked. They are built to stay shut." He straightened his back, his eyes catching the dim light. "If we cannot fix their wall, we must build our own roof." The words hung in the narrow space, stripping away the heavy resignation. For the first time in months, the air in the room seemed to thin. replaced by the sharp, electric scent of an idea finally taking root. The message moved through the city like a pulse in the dark. It traveled through handwritten notes folded into pockets and whispered conversations behind closed doors. They found the architects in the back rooms of libraries and the dreamers in the corners of assembly plants. Each person arrived at the designated workshop with the same look in their eyes, a mixture of defiance and long-suppressed readiness. Elias stood at the head of a makeshift table, his hands tracing lines on a map of the untamed regions. The room was packed, smelling of graphite and damp paper. No one spoke of the elders or the locked city towers. They spoke of structural loads, soil stability, and power distribution. They were engineers, designers, and builders who had been told their time would never come. Now, they were measuring the scale of their own potential. Sarah moved through the crowd, distributing lists of essential supplies, her movements precise and efficient. The collective frustration that had defined their lives for years underwent a sudden, sharp crystallization. It was no longer a matter of waiting for permission. It was a matter of calculating the logistics of an exit. They leaned over the blueprints, heads bowed together in the flickering light, aligning their skills toward a single, unified horizon. The plan was no longer a theory. It was a blueprint for departure. The departure began under the cover of a moonless night. They moved in silence, a procession of shadows threading through the narrow, high-walled alleys of the city. Elias led the way, his gaze fixed on the northern perimeter where the old stone barriers met the wild, unkempt scrub. As they passed the final gate, the rhythmic clicking of their footsteps against the hard, artificial pavement faded. It was replaced by the uneven crunch of dry earth and low-lying brush. The air here was different, sharper, thinner, and devoid of the heavy, recycled heat of the urban center. They marched for hours, the city skyline shrinking into a jagged, distant silhouette behind them. With every mile, the ground grew more resistant. The soil here was brittle, patterned with deep, sun-baked fissures that caught at their heels. They arrived at the edge of the barren plains just as the first gray light touched the horizon. Before them lay a vast, empty expanse of cracked, dry earth that stretched toward the mountains. No structures stood to greet them. No roads guided their path. They stopped, the weight of their packs settling against their spines, and looked out over the desolate, silent expanse. This was the place where no one else dared to build, and for the first time, the horizon belonged entirely to them. Elias knelt and drove a steel spade into the ground. It struck the surface with a sharp, metallic clang, recoiling against his grip. The earth was packed as tight as concrete, baked hard by decades of sun. He stood, wiped sweat from his brow, and gripped the handle again. Beside him, Sarah dropped to her knees, using a pry bar to lever up a heavy, jagged slab of stone. They did not speak. The sound of metal biting into dirt replaced the silence of the plains. One by one, the others followed. Some used shovels, others used their bare hands to clear away the surface debris. The dust rose in thick, choking clouds that clung to their skin. But no one stopped. They were fighting the land, forcing it to yield to their intent. Every layer of soil removed felt like shedding a weight they had carried for years. They hit a layer of deeper, cooler earth, and a collective rhythm emerged. The work was grueling, but for the first time, every drop of sweat was their own. They were no longer waiting for approval from a board of directors. They were mapping the foundation of their own future, one shovelful at a time, turning the wasteland into a beginning. The ground was no longer just dirt. It was a grid, etched with precision. Elias unrolled the blueprints he had carried from the city papers the directors had never bothered to read. He pinned them down with heavy stones, the edges fluttering in the wind. This was the blueprint for a power grid that could breathe, one that yielded to the environment rather than fighting it. They began to lift the primary supports. It was not just labor. It was a sequence of calculated movements. They hauled iron beams and bolted them into place, the sound of the wrench turning in, the quiet air ringing like a bell. As the skeletal frames climbed toward the sky, the structure defied the barren landscape. They used salvaged materials, fitting them into the gaps of their design with a logic the city had deemed impossible. The frames were lean, efficient, and interconnected. By midday, a series of vertical arcs stood firm against the horizon. They were not merely walls. They were a blueprint for survival rendered in steel. The settlement was no longer a hole in the ground. It was a silhouette taking shape, proving that the knowledge the elders had discarded was the very foundation of this new world. They stood back, watching the light catch the edges of their work, and for the first time, the horizon looked like a home. The horizon, once clear and inviting, began to blur. A thin gray line stretched across the western sky, expanding until it swallowed the sun. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and cooling dust. Elias looked up, his hand still gripping a support beam, as the light shifted from a warm gold to a sickly, bruised purple. The wind died completely, leaving a vacuum of sound that pressed against their ears. Sarah stood on the edge of the foundation, her gaze fixed on the approaching wall of clouds that churned with a low, rhythmic thrum. She reached out to catch a flapping corner of the blueprints, pinning them down with a jagged stone as the first gusts began to whip through the skeletal frames. The temperature plummeted, turning the sweat on their skin into a sudden, biting chill. They stood in the center of their half-finished work, watching the sky darken to charcoal. The structures they had labored to build now looked fragile, mere slivers of metal against the vast, encroaching pressure of the atmosphere. The silence of the plains was gone, replaced by the low, hungry moan of a storm gathering its strength. They were no longer masters of the sight. They were merely spectators to the violence about to descend. The first drop hit like a bullet. Then the sky opened. Rain turned the dry, cracked earth into a slick, treacherous slurry in seconds. Elias lunged for the main support, his hands sliding against the wet iron, but the ground beneath the beam liquefied. With a sound like a gunshot, the metal sheared and the entire structure groaned. Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing the frame, but the weight shifted too fast. The foundation buckled. It did not just collapse, it surrendered to the mud, a slow, grinding slide that pulled weeks of effort into the dark earth. The steel frames twisted, screeching as they slammed into the saturated ground. Water poured into the excavation, washing away the carefully placed stone and sand. Within moments, the site was a crater of sludge, the blueprints shredded and buried beneath the debris. The group stood on the rim of the pit, soaked and shivering, watching their progress vanish under the relentless downpour. There was no sound left except the roar of the wind and the rhythmic thud of rain hitting the mire. They stared at the empty, churning pit, their hands empty, their work erased by the fury of the storm. The rain did not stop, but the silence broke. Elias stepped into the knee-deep slurry, his boots sinking with a wet, heavy suction. He reached into the mud, fingers finding the handle of a submerged spade, and he pulled. The metal groaned as it broke free from the mire. He did not look at the others. He simply turned to the edge of the crater and drove the blade into the earth. Sarah followed, then another, and another. They moved with a raw, mechanical efficiency, turning the soil over and over until the pit began to take shape again. The water was biting, turning their skin raw, but nobody retreated to the shelter of the trees. Every movement was a rejection of the defeat they had just witnessed. They were no longer building with hope alone. They were building with the weight of experience. They cleared the twisted metal, stacking the salvageable pieces on the bank. They widened the drainage trenches, cutting deeper into the stubborn ground to ensure the next deluge would have a path to follow. Their muscles burned, their lungs ached, but the rhythm of the digging became a steady pulse. As the storm lashed their backs, they worked in perfect, grim synchronization, carving a new foundation out of the very mud that had tried to bury them. The clouds fractured, revealing a streak of pale gray light that cut across the horizon. As the rain tapered to a slow drip, the structure began to rise. Steel beams locked into place with a sharp, final clang that echoed across the barren plains. Elias stepped back, wiping the grit from his eyes, and looked up. For the first time, the frame pierced the skyline, a jagged silhouette against the fading storm. Sarah stood beside him, her hand resting on a damp support pillar that did not sway. The foundation held. They had not just cleared the mud, they had mastered the flow of the water. Slowly, the settlement took form, a series of interconnected towers that refused to bow to the landscape. In the distance, the old city remained a flat, low-lying sprawl, its lights dim and static. From this new vantage point, the horizon looked different. The monopoly of the elders was fractured. The skyline was no longer a fixed line drawn by the past, but a jagged, rising promise of what came next. Elias tightened a final bolt, the metal biting into the frame, and walked toward the edge of the rising platform. The world had tilted. The view from the outskirts was no longer a desperate gaze, but a challenge directed straight toward the heart of the city they had left behind. Time turned the frame into a pulse. The new city grew outward, its streets filling with the sound of constant motion and shifting gears. Solar arrays tracked the sun with fluid precision, feeding power into grids that hummed with capacity. Lights flickered to life in thousands of windows, a bright, interconnected web that defied the darkness. In the distance, the old city told a different story. The main power station groaned, its heavy turbines struggling to maintain a steady rotation. Lights in the central district pulsed and dimmed, failing to hold a constant glow. Old protocols, written for a world that no longer existed, jammed the automated systems, causing the machinery to grind against itself. The elders looked out from their high, static towers, watching the horizon move. They saw the new skyline expand, reaching higher, pulling the energy and the momentum toward the outskirts. Every night, the contrast sharpened. The new city shone with a steady white intensity, while the old city flickered like a dying ember. The machinery of the past was losing its grip, vibrating against the weight of its own obsolescence, while the new city hummed, accelerated, and thrived. Asha sat at the head of the circular table, the glass walls of the boardroom reflecting the sprawling city below. Data streams pulsed across the surface of the desk, a map of power grids and transit lines that she had helped draft years ago. Everything here moved with purpose. She tapped the console, and the infrastructure map zoomed in, displaying real-time efficiency ratings for the outer districts. The numbers were high, steady, and rising. She looked out the window, watching the lift platforms rise and fall along the exterior of the towers. This was the result of 1,000 small decisions, each one a fight against the inertia of the past. She checked the resource logs, adjusting the flow of energy to the northern sector with a single sweep of her hand. The system responded instantly, a silent, smooth integration that spoke of total control. She leaned back, the weight of the city resting on the foundation they had poured in the dirt so long ago. The boardroom was quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the ventilation and the periodic beep of the notification feed. She had built this space to be open, to be functional, and to be a direct reflection of the work that had defined her life. She looked at the horizon, her eyes scanning the edge of the city, ready for the next shift in the tide. The heavy glass door slid open, breaking the rhythmic hum of the boardroom. A young developer named Kale stepped inside, carrying a portable drive and a cluster of structural diagrams that looked nothing like the current grid protocols. He did not wait to be addressed. He walked to the central console, disconnected the main feed, and slotted his drive into the port. The holographic map of the city shifted immediately, the clean, orderly lines of the existing grid turning a jagged, warning red. KL tapped the interface, pulling up a simulation that showed the city exceeding its thermal capacity within 5 years. He turned to face the board, his eyes sharp, scanning the faces of the leaders who had once been the radicals of this city. There was a specific tension in his shoulders, a rigid, restless energy that cut through the calm of the room. He spoke, his voice steady but carrying the sharp edge of urgency. He did not ask for permission to speak. He laid out the flaws in the current architecture with the cold precision of a surgeon. He had the same frantic, unyielding hunger that Elias had carried into the boardroom decades earlier. He stood perfectly still, waiting for the reaction, his hands resting on the edge of the table, knuckles white, fully prepared for the rejection he expected to face. KL did not pause. He projected a new schematic onto the center of the table, a sprawling network of nodes that rendered the current power infrastructure obsolete. He spoke of heat dissipation, grid load, and the inevitable decay of the original conduits. Every point he made chipped away at the foundation the board had spent years perfecting. A ripple of movement stirred around the table. One board member leaned forward, hands gripping the edge of the desk until the knuckles lost color. Another shifted, crossing arms tightly across the chest, eyes fixed on the display with narrowed intensity. They were the ones who had dug the first foundations, yet they now sat behind the same polished barriers they had once sought to dismantle. The air in the room grew heavy, stagnant, A low murmur of disagreement began to circulate, a protective reflex against the disruption of their life's work. They were no longer the innovators. They were the gatekeepers. Kale kept his eyes on the data, his posture unyielding. Waiting for the inevitable dismissal, the boardroom temperature felt like it had climbed 10 degrees. No one spoke, but the defensive posture of the group was absolute. They looked at the projected overhaul, not as a solution, but as a direct threat to the order they had fought so hard to establish. Asha pushed her chair back, the metal legs scraping harshly against the floor. She stood, intending to shut down the proposal with the same finality she had heard 1,000 times in her youth. Her mouth opened, and the practiced words rose to the surface, ready to be deployed. We worked hard to build this. We have protocols that have functioned for decades. The sentence hung in the air, tasting of ash. As the sound of her own voice registered, her throat constricted, turning the final words into a choked whisper. She heard the ghost of the chairman, in her own tone, the flat, dismissive cadence of someone who had stopped listening. Her hands, resting on the back of the chair, began to shake. She gripped the wood until her fingers ached, trying to anchor herself against the sudden, vertigo-inducing realization. She was not the pioneer anymore. She was the wall. The silence in the room deepened, no longer just a defensive barrier, but a vacuum of her own making. She tried to pull in a breath, but the air felt too thin. She looked down at her own knuckles, white with tension, and saw the exact same posture she had once despised in the men who had locked her out. The realization hit with the force of a physical impact, draining the strength from her legs and forcing her to sink back into her seat, unable to finish the sentence. Asha remained seated, the silence stretching until it became a physical weight. She looked at Kale. She did not see a threat to her legacy. She saw the same sharp, restless hunger she had carried decades ago when she first dug into the dry earth of the outskirts. The frustration etched into his brow was a mirror of her own younger face. She felt the ego that had kept her in this seat for years begin to crack, a slow, grinding friction behind her ribs. It was a choice between the comfort of the status quo and the survival of the city she had helped forge. She reached out and pushed the stack of her own rejection notes to the edge of the desk, the paper sliding with a sharp, final sound. Her heart hammered against her chest, a frantic, rhythmic beat that signaled the end of her stagnation. She focused on the space between them, the gap where the old guard met the new. Her knuckles finally relaxed. The tension that had held her rigid for years drained away, leaving her hands steady on the table. She looked at Kale, her gaze locking onto his, searching for the defiance that was now the only thing that could save them. The room seemed to shrink, the board members fading into the periphery, leaving only the two of them at the center of the turning point. Aisha leaned back, the leather of her chair creaking in the sudden quiet. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she reached out and pulled the heavy, empty chair beside her closer, the wooden legs dragging across the floor with a slow, deliberate sound. She gestured to the seat, her palm open, a silent invitation that cut through the rigidity of the boardroom. "Show me," she said, her voice steady and stripped of its former defensive edge. "Help us build it better." The room erupted in a collective intake of breath. Around the table, the other leaders shifted, their expressions cycling from confusion to a hesitant, dawning comprehension. Kale stood still for a heartbeat, his own hands trembling slightly as he realized the wall he had prepared to fight had simply dissolved. He stepped forward, the sound of his boots echoing on the polished floor, and took the seat. As he sat, he pulled his digital tablet from his satchel and tapped the screen, projecting a complex grid of light that filled the center of the table. The board members leaned in, their faces illuminated by the glow of a future they had nearly blocked. The old cycle of rejection and stagnation fractured, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of a collaboration that had been impossible only moments before. The light from the projector bled outward, spilling past the table and warming the faces of everyone in the room. They did not retreat into their old silos. Instead, they began to move, leaning over the blueprints, fingers tracing lines of integration between the legacy structures and the new, radical ideas. Outside, the city responded. The dim, flickering street lamps that had once signaled decay steadied, turning a vibrant, pulsing white. Systems that had groaned under the weight of outdated protocols now hummed with a seamless, rhythmic efficiency. The horizon, once a boundary of separation, became a map of continuous potential. Buildings shifted their configurations, internal grids rearranging to accommodate the influx of new, sharp designs. This was not a final destination, but a permanent state of opening. The city breathed, expanding into the space they had finally learned to share. As the sun dipped below the skyline, the settlement did not go dark. It glowed, a singular, unified point of brilliance against the encroaching night. They had stopped building walls and started building a horizon that belonged to everyone. The cycle of yesterday had been dismantled, replaced by a future that remained, ever present and waiting for the next hand to reach out and improve it.